Spies. By their very nature, unless they are bad at their jobs, we shouldn't know who they were or are. Thus, we tend to think of fictionalized spies first.
Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
While these fictionalized spies going around the world in dangerous car chases is very different than the real world of espionage, which if I had to guess is a lot more boring and mind-numbingly slow burn stressful. There was, however, an actual group of British spies during the Cold War who live up to their fictional counterparts. Their job was to schmooze at parties with the enemy and get in daily car chases, trying to one-up their Soviet counterparts through sheer wits and determination. Sound familiar? And to top it all off, they did it without disguise and the tacit permission of the Soviets themselves. Their name was Brixmas. The mission has been noted by one historian as being one of the greatest successes of British intelligence during the Cold War. Although Brixmas was in equal status to the much more well-known MI5, MI6, and GCHQ, the fact that it was much smaller than its counterparts, with often less than 100 total people, only operated in East Germany, and ended along with the Cold War, are probably why it has been forgotten in popular memory, despite the fact that some of their car chases and intelligence grabs were probably some of the most stunning feats of espionage during the Cold War. This is the story of Brixmas, the British spies of the Cold War who openly and legally spied on the Soviets in East Germany. Officially titled The British Commanders-in-Chief Mission to the Soviet Forces in Germany, it was quickly shortened to Brixmas. As the Allied powers were carving up Germany and Berlin into two halves, the practical realities of splitting a country into multiple pieces, i.e. Soviet, American, British, and soon-to-be French sectors, came into focus with the Western Allies having to make arrangements with the Soviets. What would become Brixmas lay in a sort of founding charter, an Allied document signed in wartime London on the 14th of November 1944 by the Americans, Russians, and British, known as the London Agreement. The French were invited to sign in March of 1945. Entitled The Control Machinery in Germany, the document confidently anticipated the defeat of the Third Reich. Article 2 stated, each commander-in-chief in his zone of occupation will have attached to him military, naval, and air representatives of the two other commanders-in-chief for liaison duties. This, along with a more formal document signed in September of 1946, called the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, set up the terms of liaisoning duties between the militaries of the formerly Allied powers occupying Germany. The agreement allowed reciprocal arrangements for freedom of travel and circulation in each zone, with the exception of some restricted areas to be notified to the respective commander-in-chief. Wireless and telephone communications were guaranteed and couriers were granted diplomatic immunity. Each mission was to be administered by the zone in which it resided in respect of accommodation, rations, petrol, and stationery. Mission buildings were to be given full immunity. The aim of each mission was to maintain liaison between the staffs of the two commanders-in-chief and their military governments. The Soviet equivalent of Brixmas was known as Soxmas and was set up in Bund, West Germany. The terms of the Robertson-Malinin Agreement were essentially perfect for legalized spying. With a total of 37 people at the start, Brixmas was the first and the largest Western Allied military liaison unit operating in East Germany. In fact, it was the only accredited British military unit lawfully operating in Communist Germany at all. For example, when the liaison missions first started, the British had managed to negotiate 31 passes for the Brixmas mission staff, whereas the US and French missions combined only had 32. This story will mainly focus on the Brixmas mission, as there is much more available about them. They were the largest mission, and eventually they started coordinating with the French and Americans anyway. The fact that it was useful to Western countries to have people who could legally just wander around the otherwise very restricted East Germany has probably not been lost on anyone watching this video, especially since East Germany would have been the launching off point of any Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Brixmas was often able to observe things in person that other British intelligence agencies, or American, or French for that matter, either didn't know were even happening, maneuvers happening under radio silence for example, or had only heard or read reports of. Brixmas was instrumental in confirming facts in person behind enemy lines. They could get up-to-date intel that the other agencies could not get, or at the very least, they could oftentimes get it much more simply and crucially without the risk of being executed if caught. The actual mission. While yes, their original purpose of liaisoning with the Soviets was quickly overtaken by the opportunity to spy on the erstwhile allies throughout most of the Cold War, or at least up until the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the troops from Brixmas would often intermingle with Soviets at parties and other social events. While it became more difficult to have frank talks with Soviet soldiers as they became more and more terrified to speak with the British as the Cold War progressed, the Brixmas soldiers were still able to at least take the temperature of the current mood between the two powers. One interesting side effect of all the normal Soviet people and soldiers being terrified of being gulagged for saying something wrong to the British was that when someone was willing to talk to them beyond small talk, if they were smiling and willing to chat, the the BRICSMIS teams knew they were likely speaking to a KGB or a GRU agent. Another good anecdote on how the officers at BRICSMIS interacted with their Soviet counterparts comes from when a new BRICSMIS mission chief was presenting credentials to the Soviet General Zaitsev. Having been tipped off by his translator that if he commanded less than 35 minutes worth of Zaitsev's time, he would be deemed by the Soviet top brass to be a lightweight. Learmont then prodded Zaitsev to defend the failure of Soviet equipment in the Middle East, where the US armed Israelis usually won. The encounter continued for almost 3 hours. Learmont's stock rose. Another part of their liaison duties was protecting the right to freedom of movement throughout the Soviet zone. Thus, when the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, to test the rights the British possessed to cross into East Berlin, they loaded 2 wives of 2 BRICSMIS officers into a car and sent them across Checkpoint Charlie to buy opera tickets, to simply see what would happen. Apparently, the husbands were not told, and were not too happy about it either when they found out. An odd precedent was now being set. Before the wall was built, BRICSMIS visited East Berlin's opera and restaurants like other Berlin-based Allied servicemen. Afterwards, in order to show the flag, regular visits were made by members of the mission, resplendent in full mess kit with medals up. As Wellstead explained, the West was making a point, to emphasize Allied right of access to the eastern half of the divided city. The new ostentation, Gibson recounted, clearly antagonized the East German hierarchy, who also liked to be seen at the opera. When it became known on occasion that BRICSMIS had booked the best seats, the program was rapidly changed from the advertised classic to a heavily indoctrinated and politically accented modern piece. The redeeming feature of such torture was the excellent champagne and cabaret of assorted opera-goers encountered during the interval. But rather than meeting at parties, the liaisoning duties mostly dealt with stuff having to do with legitimate British interest in the now occupied Soviet zone. Finding missing British citizens from the war, making sure German industry was being destroyed and dismantled, the UK's version of Operation Paperclip, i.e. getting German scientists to join the British or helping the Americans, and investigation of war crimes from the war. Especially on the liaison side of BRICSMIS activities, they often found the Soviets had an unexpected soft spot and admiration for the British, which this often came out after large amounts of alcohol. There had been a farewell party at the mission house. He, Learmont, recalled, "I'd had a lot of champagne and was not driving my car. I was just closing my eyes when a Soviet soldier waved our column off the Autobahn. We got out. They said I was going to be detained. A team of Sovs arrived with an act, which they started to read. By now I was steaming with anger. Roy translated the act, sentence by sentence, at my request. I was charged with conducting the affairs of the British mission with professionalism and elegance. My sentence was a farewell drink with my Soviet friends. Round the corner came a whole group of their senior officers. They gave me a party at the roadside and sent me on my way. That was my last detention." Although they almost always maintained liaisoning duties, the BRICSMIS team very quickly realized the potential of the agreements they had signed and went to exercise their freedom of movement quickly beyond just Berlin. One historian notes, however, how amateurish the original attempts at espionage were because the people originally posted really were just normal soldiers on liaison duty, and were not specially picked for espionage. In what would become known as touring, the liaison teams would exit their compound in East Germany located in Potsdam just outside of Berlin, and exercise their rights of freedom of movement through the Soviet zone, and quite literally legally wander around enemy territory to see what they could find. The first instance of touring in 1946 shows just how unequipped and ill-prepared the mission was for the opportunity presented to them. Since they didn't have cars yet, the first tour they went out on foot, and the second was on horseback. One historian notes, it was arguably the last time the British Army rode horses on a military operation in Europe. In another example of their inexperience in the art of espionage, the first time they went to go take photos of a shipyard, a Royal Navy officer shot a roll of film which came back blank because he forgot to take the lens cap off. By the 1950s, however, the monthly report reveals the scope of their snooping on the Soviets. It ran to 50 pages and covered 8 topics: general, Soviet Army order of battle and military activity, paramilitary police, air information, naval information, communications, intercommunications, economic, industrial, and agricultural information. They had clearly upped their game. There were, however, limits to their tours, as some of you may have noticed in the descriptions of the Robertson-Malinin Agreement. The main restriction was that they were relegated to East Germany. They couldn't drive all the way to Moscow, let alone cross the border into Poland or Czechoslovakia. The two sides could set up restricted areas in their respective zones, and that they were to delineate these with clear signage. As the Cold War went on, and BRICSMIS and other Allied snooping increasingly aggravated the Soviets, the number of signs the Germans and Soviets put up to say an area was out of bounds for the liaison missions went from 450 in 1955 to 4,000 by 1972. The British, however, were not above a little blatant disregard for the terms of the agreement. It helped that, as part of the rules of this little game with the Soviets, British teams were always returned even if captured and roughed up a bit. The worst that could happen once caught is that the Soviets might issue a persona non grata order against a member after returning them. barring them from staying in East Germany, effectively ending their time with Brixmis. Due to this general lack of dangerous consequences, Brixmis teams would just take down the restricted area sign, and if they got caught, explain they hadn't seen it, or as one officer recounted, he told them he had forgotten his glasses. It was even a long-standing Brixmis tradition to straight up steal the signs and take them home as souvenirs. Brixmis operated out of their mission compound, located in Potsdam just outside of Berlin. In addition to the Potsdam location, there was also a main office located in West Berlin in the old 1936 Olympic Games Stadium complex, beyond the prying eyes and ears of the Stasi, as the buildings in Potsdam were completely riddled with bugs and the staff paid off to supply info to the Soviets and the East Germans. In a very interesting collision of espionage Cold War history, the route between the two compounds was the Gleinica Bridge, i.e. the Bridge of Spies Gary Powers Bridge. Because they used the Gleinica Bridge daily to get back and forth between their two buildings, one of the mission officers actually tried to cross the bridge during the Gary Powers prisoner exchange, as the Americans had not warned the Brits and actually temporarily detained the Brixmis officer until it was over. Now, unlike Q Branch providing James Bond with some wild and spectacular gadgets, most of the equipment being given and used by Brixmis was often not very exciting. Like everything else at the beginning, recording information was very low-tech, i.e. drawing. This was eventually upgraded to a Leica M3 camera in a succession of commercially available cameras until the end of the Cold War. In addition to their cameras, the other main piece of gear for recording was a tape recorder for dictation, which was faster than writing stuff down. But their most important piece of kit that they relied on, and which was heavily modified, was their cars. It makes sense that their cars were the most important, because as we shall see, although the Soviets nominally let them drive around East Germany, they would often either try and follow the Brixmis teams or catch them doing something they were not supposed to be doing, i.e. spying, and thus a main part of the Brixmis' job was on-road and off-road car chases with the Soviet authorities in order to get away and back to their headquarters before getting caught. One former member of Brixmis from the very early days recalled, "Touring was made unannounced on the basis of the liberty of movement supposedly authorized by our diplomatic status and confirmed by our passes. Our vehicles were Humber boxcars painted dark red with the Union flag all over them to ensure that we could not be accused of clandestine action. These were subsequently replaced by khaki-colored Humber snipes. All cars, a fleet of 13 at the time, had the Union emblem on the bumper. We wore uniform at all times on tour and carried no arms." Later on, although they had a few vehicles at their disposal, such as Range Rovers and various Mercedes, the mainstay of their tours became Admiral and the Senator Opel sedans. Smaller and harder to spot on the horizon, the four-door Opels were also doctored to look like Eastern Bloc Volgas from a distance. This was on top of their Ferguson-sourced four-wheel drive systems, armored plates installed to protect against mines and other under-vehicle injuries, massive 50-gallon fuel tanks, and matte-color paint jobs with blacked-out interiors to further discourage detection. For nocturnal operations, auxiliary lights were installed inside and out, with both standard spots and infrared gear in place, later for use when driving while wearing night vision goggles. In addition, the cars were also modified with two hooks front and rear. The petrol tank was reinforced to protect it from obstacles hit in rough terrain. The boot held a reserve tank containing 100 liters of fuel. Though he did not say so, it is clear that a fully laden tour car was a potential bomb in a serious crash. Switches on the dashboard could cut out the stoplights and taillights. The toolkit included a winch and other toboggan gear, as well as sandboards, ground anchor pins, and a sledgehammer to drive them home. Several pairs of heavy leather gloves were carried to avoid frostburn on hands in very cold weather when handling the winch and wire rope. The cars also had sleeping bags and multiple days of food for longer tours. In an actual scenario where double O's did exist, they probably would have something like this. With their cars and their cameras and operating out of Potsdam, they traveled all over East Germany. In order to prepare for these tours, where they were essentially driving around looking for anything interesting, to know what was interesting, mission members had to take recognition classes weekly or even towards the end of the Cold War every day, going through books and photographs of every known piece of Soviet military hardware in order to recognize anything they might come across. They were also sent out to look at specific things, which ranged from artillery ranges, uranium mines, to figuring out what all the secrecy was on the island of Rügen, which the Soviets would not let them near when they tried to get close. Turned out it was a Soviet death camp in the old Prora complex built during the Second World War. A Brixmis team did eventually manage to sneak in on a snowy December evening in 1952 to figure out what was there. The guards on the bridge just waved them across in the awful conditions. After having successfully snooped around and having left, they were stopped by the Soviets in Bergen. After being taken to see the local Soviet officer in command, their excuse for why they had been there was that they were planning their summer holidays, the joke being they were doing it during a snowstorm. A top-secret Brixmis monthly report from March 1953 gives a further idea of the type of intelligence the tours were gathering. 23 tours went out. They covered, among other targets, 21 active Soviet airfields and 2 inactive ones. As to ground forces, our main efforts have been directed to making continuous barracks checks and watching training areas for formations moving into them. 10 out of 23 tours were not followed, and 2 more managed to evade their pursuers. Though one mission car was detained briefly in West Germany by an RAF sentry who claimed it belonged to a foreign mission. Most of the types of weapons and military equipment in use in the Red Army have been seen during the month. Clear views have been obtained of the Signals Command vehicle on a Soviet chassis which is being produced for the Red Army in East Germany. The new East German Army Jeep-type vehicle and the new half-ton Fanelmann Granite have been seen. The later is definitely fitted with 4-wheel drive. Another long-standing and important Brixmas mission was waiting by tracks for military trains to pass and taking note. The way they did this in the late 60s was one person would talk into a tape recorder and note the type and number of each vehicle, while the other operated a camera. They always came back with around 20 rolls of film from their tours. They also had plans for when they were caught, which happened relatively frequently. When getting caught taking pictures, they had an already exposed fake roll ready to swap into the camera, and they couldn't use a blank fresh roll because the Soviets could then frame them by taking new photos. So the goal was to take a fake dummy roll, put it in the camera, then open the back and ruin it in front of whoever caught them, or at least make sure it was shot all the way through, with pictures that didn't mean anything. While most of the time they would bring photos and audio logs home, they would oftentimes not really find anything interesting at all, and it was extremely boring. But sometimes Brixmas missions brought back something a little more exciting than some rolls of film, including bringing back unused ammunition that they found at firing ranges to even an unexploded practice bomb that was 5 feet long and contained 12 pounds of high explosive that failed to detonate. They ended up bringing it back to the top floor of the HQ in Berlin using the elevator. The building was subsequently evacuated, and Brixmas teams were advised to no longer bring unexploded ordnance into the building. It was the 1st of May, 1981, May Day, an important holiday in communist circles. The British knew that the Soviets would likely be more lax and not fully on their guard. In a great example of how often the terms of the Robertson-Malin agreements were flaunted, in the early morning they drove straight onto a Soviet Army tank gunnery range and proceeded to break into as many tank sheds as they could. Eventually, they found one with 5 T-64 tanks with no one guarding them. The key reason they were sent out to find a T-64 tank, no one on the NATO side had ever seen the inside of one, because they weren't able to get inside because it required a specific key to open the hatch. But DI-51E, a branch in the Directorate of Scientific Intelligence, had recently managed to forge a T-64 hatch key by combining a video clip from Soviet television, which showed the tank hatch being opened, and a Brixmas photograph taken from a bridge over a train track, taking a picture down on top of a passing T-64. One historian noted this bit of craftsmanship for a specialty item was rather exceptional, as most of the items we supplied were standard commercial products, unlike the funny kit James Bond took with him. Our purpose was to provide the collectors with kit which made their tasks easier or indeed possible. Once the team realized the key to the hatch worked and they could get inside, they backed the car against the shed door and had a driver stay in the car, one person in between the car and the tank, and one person in the tank tape recording what he saw with audio and also taking pictures. The person in the tank only had one roll of film with him at a time, so in case they got caught, some film would already be hidden in the car. They managed to get away clean. Several years later, the American version of Brixmas tried to do this exact same thing with the T-80 and got shot dead by a Soviet sentry, leading to one of the few incidents where a member of a liaison mission was killed in action. The British had gotten very lucky. As the main way they went around gathering information, other than by aerial photography in 2 chipmunk planes by turning the plane sideways and taking pictures downwards, was by driving around in their fleet of vehicles, they often had to try and escape being tailed by the East Germans and Soviets. Due to the terms of the agreements, how it essentially worked was a real game of cops and robbers, as self-described by an ex-Brixmas member. If you got caught, you would most likely be questioned and held for at most 12 hours, and then either sent back or escorted back to the mission headquarters. Unusually for spies, they were not at risk of being executed or held indefinitely in prison, although there were still significant risks. The team would see it as failure to overexcite the Germans and cause them to shoot at the car. Although luckily no one on the British side was ever killed, in 1962, one driver was shot by East German soldiers and seriously injured. However, in 1984, French mission officer Philippe Mariotti was killed instantly when the Stasi purposely rammed their tour car off the road with a truck. An American Major Arthur Nick Nicholson was shot by a Soviet sentry in 1985, trying to get into that T-80 tank. But for the most part, their diplomatic protection and sheer guts led directly to absolutely wild car chases. Almost every time the Brixmas teams left their mission compound in Potsdam, they were tailed by Soviet or East German cars. Although they were in a car clearly marked with the British flag and plates, they would try and lose their tails as quickly as possible in order to perform their spying undisturbed. Kind of goes without saying, since they could not be imprisoned, they did not have to obey any East German traffic laws. This meant they would often be driving well over 100 miles an hour and off-roading. Other than losing tails before trying to do espionage, the other reason they got into car chases was being caught in the act of espionage. This was where the stakes were at their highest, because if they were cornered and the immunity of their car was not observed, as it often was not, they would lose any photographs or recordings they may have gathered, so they needed ways to get away. Here are some of the tricks that they relayed to historians of how they would get away from their Soviet and East German pursuers. Trick number 1. Spot them first. They would accelerate from a standing start while we were traveling at 35 miles an hour. We could then accelerate to a turn-off point before they could keep us in sight. Trick number 2. Acceleration. We would take the narcs, what they called the people tailing them, to the nearest autobahn. Cruise gently at 50 miles an hour. The narc may be a half mile behind. Approaching a long incline, the Brixmas driver would change down and accelerate hard uphill. The clapped-out East German car with its low-grade petrol was no match for the immaculately maintained Opel Capitan with its high-octane Western fuel. We usually lost sight of the narc long before we turned off at one of the autobahn's exits. Trick number 3, the lay-by ploy. Some laybys, noted in advance, led off the autobahn, but were not overlooked by the road and also provided some sort of exit to the local countryside. Trick number 4, the wives' tale. In December 1958, Group Captain John Boardman, foot successor, and I spent a night with our wives at the Potsdam Mission House. Next morning, one car, with the ladies, en route to Leipzig, picked up the guard narc at one of the Potsdam exits. John and I followed 5 minutes later along the same route and had a clear run. The ladies spent the day shopping in Leipzig, leading the narcs a merry dance on the escalators of the Konsum department store. John and I did our day's work, and we all rendezvoused at the hostelry in Eisenach. Another fun trick. An East German army squad came doubling across the fields to stop us. I told my driver to slow down. As he did so, I whipped up a smart salute, whereupon the whole squad halted and tried to present arms. And then I said, speed up. By the time they got their arms down, we were off. Another trick was they could toggle even the back lights of their car and brake lights. So on the Autobahn, they would put a turn signal on for an exit at night, and then turn off all the lights as they flew past, and the tails would take the exit. Another great anecdote was, I was on tour with Colonel Badger. Great name, by the way. That's my commentary. We were followed all day by a Stasi BMW. After midnight, we stopped for a pee. The Stasi, parked 12 inches from our rear bumper, did likewise. Then we got back into the car and had coffee and a sandwich before settling down to sleep. I lay back and relaxed, one eye on the rearview mirror. The narcs obviously thought we couldn't get away without alerting them, and they dropped off to sleep. I asked the colonel if he wanted to get away, and I got a yes. I waited for the next big truck to come thundering past us. When it was making the most noise, I hit the starter and we were away. The narcs were zizzing contentedly, unaware that they had the lay-by all to themselves. And probably one of my favorite stories from my readings of their car chases. With his driver, Royal Marine Corporal Dye, he, Griffiths, was followed on one mission for several hundred miles. In a small market town, they spotted a man on the pavement with his back to us, wearing a good overcoat, which could only be bought from a party store. This stalwart of the Communist Party they now used as a decoy. We approached him from behind and stopped the car. So did our tail. I called him over, holding up the map, making sure the tail could see what was going on. I asked the man in the overcoat for advice about the route back to Potsdam. He was only too pleased to help us. Griffiths drove away. The narcs behind him, convinced they had detected high treason, pounced on the man in the overcoat. By the time they had sorted out the confusion, said Griffiths contentedly, we were on our own. Not every getaway was successful. One notable story involved taking photos of a new pontoon bridge system, being subsequently discovered, trying to drive away, realizing the only open route was across the newly constructed bridge itself, and getting caught because it wasn't entirely finished and crashing directly into the river. In addition, another, frankly unsurprising factor in their car chase hijinks was that there were occasional accidents with civilians. This is not surprising because oftentimes Brixmas teams would not only have a car chase through open fields, but small German villages or cities at full speed. And while their train drivers were good, there was the occasional accident involving civilian vehicles or pedestrians, including one notable case where a Brixmas car hit a motorcyclist at high speed and killed him instantly. So why did the Soviets never try to end Brixmas? As one historian notes, 1. If they ended this one part of the post-war agreements on dividing Germany with the Allies, the rest might also unravel. 2. They also enjoyed benefits with their own agents and socksmiths operating in the British sector, Soximus dabbled in dangerous business of running agents as part of a hostile and predatory spying operation in West Germany. 3. The author posits it was also a method of Soviet deterrence against NATO's attack, allowing the Allies to get a decent sense of how strong the Soviets were. The same historian also notes that although the Soviets allowed the liaisons to spy, they definitely tried their hardest along with the East German Stasi to disrupt it, just as the British Royal Military Police, and particularly 19 support platoon known as the White Mice, tried to disrupt Soximus in West Germany. But their story is most definitely a tale for another time. By late 1980s, when Gorbachev was in power, the Brits didn't want to give any ammo to the opponents of reform in the Soviet Union, who still insisted that the West was a threat, so they discontinued aggressive touring. Gun-ho touring, as it were, was no longer acceptable, which included driving at excessive speeds, or over other people's gardens, or inserting oneself unnecessarily into the middle of Soviet convoys, and so on. Although they would still try and get intelligence, they were not as aggressive as before. I would also suspect it had something to do with the French and American members having died in 1984 and 1985 respectively. While the wall came down on November 11, 1989, Germany would not formally reunify until October 3, 1990. Quote, "The end was now in sight. On the 2nd of October 1990, 11 months after the wall was breached, 10 Brixmas tour crews met in a forest near Klein-Benitz, 20 miles west of Berlin, for a barbecue to mark the suspension of the Robertson-Malinin Agreement." Author Tony Garrity contends Brixmas did important work that no one else was able to do during the Cold War, and it helped ease tensions by discovering facts about equipment, but also about intentions and the opinions of the Soviet command as part of their liaison duties. It is noted, however, that most of Brixmas' intelligence cues came earlier on, and towards the end they were not gathering as much useful intelligence as other sources were. But what it did do to the very end was give the British plausible deniability for their other more secret sources to deflect to the perfectly legal and well-known Brixmas. There was a third, deeply secret raison d'etre, which no one explained to them, but which Brixmas soldiers believed was the most important in those days and long after. This was that Brixmas was the ideal cover for other sources of intelligence, which had to be protected from accidental compromise when their product was circulated within the Allied intelligence community. And with that, Brixmas mostly faded out of all knowledge except in the realm of those who served, what was deposited in archives, and where I found out about them, an exhibit in the National Army Museum in London. Brixmas had one last role to play that it never had to execute. If World War III had ever started, Brixmas would probably have gone to ground to become the first NATO stay-behind team of the Third World War. It can take much credit for the fact that this final role remained hypothetical. I'd also like to thank the volunteer at the National Army Museum in the Brixmas exhibit when I was the only person there, and they basically gave me a guided tour of the whole place and gave me the inspiration for making this video. So thank you to them once again. That was probably over a year ago now. As well as Tony Garrity for the book The Untold Exploits of Britain's Most Daring Cold War Spy Mission, Brixmas, which was the main source for this video and a great book if you want to know more and go more in depth.